Hi, it is the Ego Project, and Christine and I are back, and we are going to be delving into the ego and codependency, which is something that we all need to learn about and know more about. And I'm excited to hear, where Christine takes us on this journey and share a little bit about my codependency experiences,
Absolutely.
because there are quite a few.
Yeah. Yeah, I think codependency is actually something that we kind of throw around a lot in our own relationships. But we don't always, it's kind of like narcissism. We don't always understand what it means and what it looks like. So I'm really excited to be talking about this as far as ego, relationships, and how codependency is involved in those.
Me too. And, I so agree with you on that. I think so many people, if you ever say, oh, they're codependent, there's almost a shame around that. And people will push back. They're like, I'm an independent person. I don't need anybody. And I think it's that misunderstanding of what codependency actually means, understanding that there's a spectrum of it. It can, be from, codependent, a little bit in certain aspects, all the way through, abusive relationships, something that really derails your life. And also recognizing that it's not just a romantic.
No,
it's not just with our romantic partners. It's not with, our, married partners. It can be colleagues and bosses and friendships, and we can go on. Any type of relationship can be codependent. So I think that's a great place for us to jump in and have you, Christine, tell us what codependency is.
Absolutely. So, really codependency as a term kind of came out in talking about a particular relationship where someone in the relationship is the overly giving of self, and the other one is the overly taking of self, right? But in its existence, they're both trying to get their needs met. So one of the most, typical codependent relationships we kind of think about is somebody who is an addiction, and then somebody who is the enabler, right? So we have this person who is, has some form of addiction, and the other person is the enabler. So they change what they think, feel, and do in order to get the addict to kind of stop using or to mitigate the harm that can happen to the addict. And the addict just continues to kind of take from that, giving energy and not really addressing the addiction. So you see this dance of trying to, change who the giver is in order to mitigate the damage that the taker is doing. And so that's kind of like the relationship that we use as a framework for codependency. Now in more modern times, we look more at, especially within relationships, we look at more of the, dependent person to maybe somebody who is more of the egotistic person, right? So the dependent person changes what they think, feel, and do in order to get the egotistic person to meet their needs. I see you, I hear you, always trying to the dependent is always trying to get their needs met. And then the egotistic one just likes receiving from the dependent one. So when we talk about codependency in more, layperson vernacular now, codependency typically talks about a person's traits that tend to lead them into more codependent relationships, whether that's with somebody with addiction or somebody that has more egotistic personality. The codependent person in the relationship tends to be the one that is giving more of self and changing or shaping themselves in order to get a desired response from the other person.
Is that the lie that where codependency first begins, the thing that I don't know if it'd be considered a lie, but that kind of allows it to that seed of it to take root is it feels so good to give. It feels so good to receive, right? And our culture has taught us that, well, when you're in a relationship, you want to always meet the needs of the other person, in order to make it work. So is that really where it originates in our lives? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in a healthy relationship, we're going to have needs. People are always like, oh, you should meet your own needs. Well, yeah, I mean, internally, you should meet your needs as far as knowing that you're good and valuable and worthy, because you are, right? Just intrinsically. But when we show up in relationships, we do have needs. It doesn't matter if it's parent, child, friendship, relationship, coworkers. There are needs that have to be met, right? So in a healthy relationship, we say, hey, these are my needs. The other person says, I see your needs, I hear your needs, and I'm willing to meet those needs. Here are my needs. And the other person says, I see your needs, I hear your needs, I'm willing to meet those needs. And they start kind of navigating the relationship in harmony. If something disrupts it and it feels like disrespect or discomfort, then we have a conversation around it. But yes, we show up to have our needs met, and being willing to meet the other person's needs in healthy relationship. So yes, people with codependent traits are trying to show up in that same space, but they don't necessarily know how to do that in a healthy way, probably because of the ego wounding that occurred in childhood.
And that's my next question is, where does the wounding typically occur? It is in your early life, correct? Like you said, childhood. And exactly what ways does that wounding occur?
Right. So, codependency really is a belief system that if I change, it's about me, or if I go about this differently, or if I were to just change this perspective about myself, then this other person will meet my needs, and we can continue in this relationship. So that really does go back into childhood, and it tends to be more of, if you've listened to the podcast or watched these videos for a little while, we go back into what type of wounding and person develops from that wounding. And this would be more of the internalizers, right? So they're very self-sufficient, very independent. They seem to have this kind of like sustainable energy to give in relationships. And so in childhood, in some dynamic, the story of, well, if I were to be more like this, if I were to, show up in this way, if I were to achieve this, whatever that story is, in order to get my caretakers to meet my needs, that's the internalizer narrative that starts. And that tends to be the adults that show up in relationships, friendships, and continue to have that internalizing story. And they have that energy to continue to show up in that space that, ends up being exceptionally frustrating for them.
So it is that internalizing, and what you just described is what I call the hustle.
Yes.
Yeah, where you're hustling to get your needs met. You're trying to convince someone of your worth, and it seems the less they want to give, the more you hustle. The more you're going to give, the more you're going to try and convince them that, yes, you can give to me, I'm worthy, you're going to want to give to me, right? So it really is about shifting the focus from the other person onto yourself, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And what steps can you take to do that, to shift that focus?
Well, and I think this is actually like a really, the signs of that codependent relationship, where you have the dependent and then you have the egotistic or the taker in the relationship, is that you do see kind of those toxic traits where the dependent one is like pursuing and trying to be, trying to be seen and heard, and the egotistic or unhealthy in a different way, person will take and take and take, and then starve kind of the dependent person. If they start pulling back and try to have boundaries, they'll try to starve that and be like, well, I'm going to punish you by not giving you attention, or I'm going to punish you by going out drinking. I'm going to, and so the codependent tends to pursue again to try and get back in their good graces. So what you end up seeing is this really toxic dance of the codependent, person really trying to convince the other person to meet their needs. And unfortunately, the codependent and the egotistic tend to really use toxic traits to do that. It's a very manipulative kind of relationship. Sometimes this originates in childhood. We may have had egotistic parents that kind of conditioned us to be like, you're in my good graces as long as you do X, Y, and Z. And so we're constantly shifting and changing ourselves to do that. And then when we do that, they're like, no, now you need to be like this, or you've done this and it's still not good enough, right? And then that typically shows up in other relationships as well, where the codependent is constantly shifting and changing themselves, and the other partner takes and takes and takes. And then if they're not getting enough, then they're like, well, now I'm gonna use toxic behaviors to pull more from you. So it is this really kind of unhealthy dance where the more codependent partner is in this like giving, chasing.
So when you're doing couples therapy, I'm assuming that the person that initiates coming to therapy is the internalizer, the overfunctioner, because they're exhausted. They're not getting their needs met. They think there's something wrong with them,
right?
Or they recognize there's something wrong with the relationship. So how do you, and I think we know a lot about the person who's initiating, right? The chaser, we hear about it in our culture, we see it in ourselves, like, oh, I'm working way too hard trying to get my needs met. Can you give us some insight into that taker? That's the person I'm really curious about, because they deserve love too. They want love too. They're getting their needs met in some way, right? Can you give us kind of a profile or understanding or insight into that taker so that we can avoid them if we need to?
Yeah,
or
right.
work with them. So, kind of give us shine the spotlight on them. I'm curious about them.
Yeah, and I think like we've kind of talked about in all of these, discussions, is that everything is kind of on a spectrum, so somebody that has more of those codependent traits can just have, like very minimal, and it may just come out when there's conflict, right? When, kind of their tolerance level is down and it's high conflict, and they're like, here come those codependent traits. And the same thing on that taker, egotistic, partner in the relationship, where, that may only come out when it feels like abandonment or anything like that is on the horizon. And so these really do, and you ask about couples therapy, these really do show up not only with their traits, but also their attachment styles. And I don't think we've gone in too much into attachment styles, which we can do in another discussion, but we're talking more about like that anxious and avoidant attachment. So for people who don't know what anxious avoidance attachments are, anxious attachment is where they're trying to pursue and chase and convince the other partner that this is a good relationship, that they're worthy, that the other partner should be with them. And avoidant attachment is more along the lines of afraid of abandonment. And so they are kind of like, whenever I feel too vulnerable, I'm going to push you away so that I don't get hurt. So we see a lot of this in that giver, taker, codependent dance, is that it tends to be the one that is the giver has more of that anxious attachment, right? Of like, let me convince you that I'm lovable. And then the taker is like, well, as long as we're focused on me and I feel good, I'm going to continue to take. But the moment that you stop, I'm going to kind of put my wall up and say, no, I've got to push you away because this feels like abandonment. I'm used to getting from you. And so you do get kind of that anxious avoidant dance, which is actually a very typical relationship dynamic, especially in intimate relationships in adulthood.
And so let's take the couples therapy as an example. You have a couple that comes in and you have an overgiver, and I want to make sure to clarify that it's not always a female,
right?
Or identified at birth female
Right.
as an overgiver, right?
Correct.
And,
Mhm.
sometimes, the male will take on the role of the household. They're doing all
Correct.
the cleaning, all the, the cooking, they're doing all the child care, and
Right.
the balance, there's a power imbalance, right? Is that always part of a codependent relationship? Is the power imbalance?
Yeah, and I think it's the way I treat couples, and I was actually just talking to one of my therapists at the practice about this. Typically, when treating couples, you want to look at those attachment, because you tend to have that anxious and avoidant, which tends to be that dependent, the giver and the taker, and there's imbalance there, right? You want to look at that, and then you also want to look at energies. Like, who is wanting to be the initiating energy and who wants to be the receiving energy, and is it in its cycle pattern? So typically when couples show up, we have more of the dependent and the taking, and what it feels like is the one that exhibits more of the codependent tendencies is seeking therapy. Like, if I schedule therapy, then my partner will come and this will fix everything, right? So it's, again, if I do something, I can change them. And that's the narrative. If I think something different, if I feel something different, if I do something different, then I can get them to meet my needs. So it's really about trying to change somebody else. And so that tends to be the one that is calling and scheduling the appointment. Not always. Sometimes it's mutually like, hey, yes, like, let's definitely do couples therapy. But it tends to be the one that's like ready for change and ready to change the other person, really. Is the one that's calling and making it. And then when you're in the therapeutic room, you can see that one tends to have more of the, like, I'm ready to make this change, like, let's get this going. And the other tends to be a little bit more, reserved and not willing to put as much sustainable energy into the change.
And that's within a romantic relationship, right?
Mhm.
A partnered
Mhm.
relationship. But as we discussed earlier, you can have codependency in anything. Do you find that someone who is codependent in a romantic relationship tends to have the same traits through most of their life? Other
Absolutely.
vessels.
Yeah. So, those codependent traits really are part of how these people have had their ego wounding, and they're showing up in any relationships, right? So what you may hear from somebody who has codependency traits would be like, even in friendships, right? So kind of having dialogue via text, and you're talking about something difficult, and the other person's like, hey, are you mad at me? Did I say something wrong? It's okay. We don't have to talk about this anymore. If you want to do the X, Y, and Z, that's fine. Right. So they're going to be the ones that are kind of like negating what they are really trying to move forward with, because they're afraid that they've offended you, or you're going to think differently about them. And in the workplace, it could be somebody who's like, no worries, I'll take it on. That's fine. I can handle it, and somebody be like, no, it's okay. Really, like, you've got your plate full. No, it's fine. I don't want anybody else to have to deal with it. I'll just take it. Right. And so they're more likely to kind of show up in those spaces and negate what they actually really need in order to keep other people okay or happy with them, so to speak. Yeah.
I'm very curious. If you are, looking at yourself and ready to make some changes in your life, and you recognize that you have trouble with, boundary setting, you have trouble communicating your needs, you have trouble getting your needs met, and you're like, oh, I think I have codependent traits, right? I'm
Right.
curious about, where do you start? Because in my mind's telling me that you start with stopping and taking a good hard look at yourself and
Mhm.
going internal. But
Yes.
I'm an internalizer. Of course I go internal, right?
Mhm.
So I'm curious, what is the very first thing you would encourage someone to do?
I just love that I got to watch you make that statement, because those that may be listening to this weren't able to see the video, but you actually put your hands over kind of your chest and like your stomach area, and you're like, you go internally, right? That is the first step to recognizing I need to make change. And for people who have the codependent traits, and that's kind of like their automatic response to relationships, and especially discomfort in relationships, is if you check in with your body at that exact moment that something has occurred and it does not feel good, that is your very first indicator, is your initial like, oh, and you feel it right here in your body, whether it felt like disrespect, or it felt like something that was really uncomfortable for you, right? We see this oftentimes in friendships and in intimate relationships, like denying what you're comfortable with because you don't want the other partner to be like, oh, well, you're such a prude, or, my last girlfriend did that. I don't know what the big deal is, right?
Or you did it before.
Or you've done it before. I'm sure you've done that, right? And it's that automatic feeling in your authority, that intuition, that gut feeling where you're like, oh, that didn't feel good. That is your first indicator that you're showing up in a space that you have to listen to that first, right? Like that should be your first indicator that something doesn't feel good. And then what you do from that point will determine whether you're moving into a codependent pattern, or if you're moving into a more, healthier autonomous pattern. So that first indicator of discomfort or disrespect, how we make a choice in that moment determines codependent patterns or healthy, self-confident patterns.
Do you find through your experience of working with individuals and couples that if someone who has a history of codependency, if they show up and they're healing that behavior and trait,
mm-hmm.
does the taker, the one who typically, has the anxious, right, personality, right, or style, right?
Mm-hmm.
If let me make sure I can express this well. Do they typically adjust to what the giver is doing? Does that make sense? Like, I'm not saying asking that well.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Or do they just go away and go find someone else to feed the animal?
I mean, both, right? I mean, it really determines where they are on the spectrum, so more on the shorter side or the lesser side of these tendencies. When somebody with codependent tendencies recognizes, oh, this doesn't feel good, and I'm going to move forward with a boundary to honor myself, then the taker may be a little bit like taken aback and be like, oh, well, that's a bummer, because I mean, I've enjoyed taking from you, right? Or I've enjoyed your giving of me in that way, but I recognize that I care about you and I care about this relationship and I want it to be healthy. So I'll respect your boundary and I'll kind of counter on my side to make space for that boundary, right? So those are two individuals that are recognizing, oh, we want to maintain a healthy relationship. So as we were moving in harmony, something came up, and this is something this partner is working on. And so I'm going to respect that boundary, even though at first I was a little taken aback by it, right? So that initial response may be like, why? It's not that big of a deal, right? It might be a little like confronting in that way. But then on the other side of the spectrum, where we may have, exceptionally codependent traits in one partner and very narcissistic and egotistic traits in the other partner, what could happen is the boundary is set and the taker is like, no, I'm going to keep pressing you to put your boundary down, put it down, put it down. And depending on where the person with the codependent patterns is at in their own self-healing, if they stand firm in it, and the narcissistic, egotistic partner has not done any work, they will leave that and go find somebody else to take from, right? Or if the codependent partner has not done a lot of work, they'll constantly lessen their boundary over and over and over again, but it constantly comes back. It's a cycle of it. The beautiful thing is our true self is always calling us home. And so regardless of how many times we say, okay, that's fine, I'll let my boundary go, it comes back up. It's not, the true self is never allowing us to get away. It will always call us home. So yeah, you can have a spectrum of navigating these patterns and still maintaining a healthy relationship, or you can have it all the way on the other side of the spectrum where toxic patterns become so so solidified that real harm occurs in the relationship. And unfortunately, the person with codependent patterns tends to be the one that is left and kind of discarded on that really far end of the spectrum.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important, because that in the codependent dynamic, it's fear, the fear that they're going to leave, or the fear they're going to stop getting what their needs met, right? And so it's fear is always part, it's the third person, right? Third thing in
the driver,
in that relationship. And so when you are in an interdependent relationship, where you have, each person has their own independence, right? In the relationship, and then you come together and the relationship is interdependent, where you meet each other's needs. Like you said, there's a dance. Can you give us some insight of what that would look like?
So that really is what a healthy relationship should look like, is having independence outside of the relationship. So what you want to pursue professionally, what you like to do for hobbies, how you like to restore your energy, friendships that you have, on both sides, right? Both sides should have this independence where they still have this sense of self. And then they come to the relationship and they get to celebrate their independence and their uniqueness, and how the relationship comes together, and who they are as a couple. And then they get to spend that time and have restorative time, and then they go back out into the world as their independence, doing all those things and pursuing all those things that independently satisfy them, and then come back to the relationship and they get to share and celebrate that, and really kind of build this separate identity within the relationship. Unfortunately, in the codependent dance, we actually call that, it's very difficult to have independent identities, because so much of the relationship is contingent on who each is individually.
So as an example, let's say that, you're moving along independently, it's a new relationship, you both have things that you're excited about, and you find yourself as, the codependent giver, starting to cancel plans with friends because your partner wants you to stay in that night. You start, giving, making all the meals they like, as opposed to the ones that and so it's things like that start very small, and right, and that grow into something larger until the scales are very out of balance.
Correct.
And so would your advice be, when you're entering a new relationship, because that's exciting, right? You're excited about the person, you're learning about them, you have that stage where you want to be enmeshed all the time with each other. What do you do right there? Because that is really where you make or break a relationship, right? If you get 10 years down the road and start trying to break these, you've got a lot more work on your plate than at the initiation stage. So how do you do that?
Well, I'll talk about it from like a clinical and therapeutic perspective, and then I would love to get kind of like your own sense of how you believe to navigate that through that. So, really what you want to take note of is, when you're in the relationship, how are you feeling in the relationship? And then when you leave the relationship to go have your own independent life, are you thinking, feeling, and doing things in order to continue to still have influence over that other person and the relationship, right? So you gave a good example of like, are you changing what you make and what you want to eat? It could also be as simple as, are you constantly checking in with them to see if they're drinking? Are you requiring FaceTimes at certain times of the day? Are you able to go out with your friends and enjoy your time, or are you constantly, texting them to see if they're responding? A work relationship might be like, can you leave the office and not constantly be checking your email to see if your coworker is sending anything to you? So are you able to leave the relationship and have your own experiences, your own thoughts, and your own feelings separate from the relationship? And so that's kind of like your first marker, is how are you recognizing yourself when you leave the relationship? And if you have codependent tendencies and you're in the healing process, those do tend to come up at the very beginning of a relationship, because you do have that little bit of adrenaline rush, but also like the unknown, like, where is this going to go? So that's what it looks like. What it looks like to start identifying those codependent tendencies is how you are when you leave the relationship.
I think that's so good, because that's really, of course, if you're, in a relationship that you've been in for quite some time, this work still can be done. But if you can start off in a relationship with that interdependence as the focus,
Yes.
and the norm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I've witnessed people who have to, be on a phone call at a certain time, no matter where they're at, no matter what they're doing. And if they miss it or choose not to do it, oh, there's hell to play.
Right.
It's, they know that it's going to be, serious fallout.
Yeah, there's going to be a consequence for it, basically.
Exactly. And that's, that's no way to live, I mean, who wants to live that way? So, but I think that's so important to talk about, when you start out, what the expectations are. And, I've shifted between codependency, interdependence in my life. So there's no judgment there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You learn as you go, and you try to get better, and you try to do better.
So what do you think has been helpful in your own kind of recognizing that you've been on that spectrum of codependency, which I have as well, right? And how have you navigated through recognizing that and working on it, basically?
That's a great question. And it's also, once again, it's a complex situation that not one thing worked. It wasn't just like, okay, I've got the magic pill here, right? And everything's working there. And I found, for me, and I still struggle with it, I grew up in a very codependent household. My early life, there was a lot of trauma, a lot of wounding, and so it's been a lifetime journey for me. And I'm getting to the point where, like, oh, okay, I see it, which is the first thing. And like you said, being able to go, okay, I recognize this in me. I recognize this is a struggle area for me, and I am going to do what I can do to learn how to navigate it, and also learn how to heal it. I think it is, I think sometimes we're like, if we recognize that we have codependent traits, one, I think there's shame attached to it, because, I'm an independent woman who, wants to portray that, wear that mask, and to be able to say, yeah, okay, I see where I've done that, where I've done the chasing. I've tried to convince someone of my worth, tried to convince them to invest in me. And there's a little bit of embarrassment about that.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I didn't do it intentionally, right? But I did take a step back from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Taking a step back from that's that aha moment inside where you're like, ew, this makes me uncomfortable, or this feels disrespectful. Yeah.
And I took the time to recognize not only what I was feeling, in my body, but to keep kind of chewing on, okay, there's something here. I don't know yet. There's something deeper that is causing me to behave in this manner.
Right.
And I didn't focus on the other person. Maybe they are narcissists. I don't know. Maybe they are, they have wounded ego. Maybe they have anxious attachment. I don't care.
Right. It's not really about that.
It's not. It's about me. And the answer did not come immediately. It wasn't an immediate, oh, okay, I understand. Because our lives are complex. I mean, there's layered, we have had so many different ego woundings throughout our life. And I have to say, when I finally figured it out, it did come like, oh, there's one aspect of it. There was a peace that came over me. And the looping thoughts, right?
Yes.
Dissipated.
Right.
And that was my experience. It won't be that way for everyone else. It will be, maybe that no is just a little easier to give.
Yes. And I love that you talk about saying no, right? Because that is, self-neglect is the telltale sign of codependency. It's the self, being, neglecting self, and that means sacrificing your time, your energy, your things that are valuable to you, your resources, right? It's neglecting self. And no is a great place to start with honoring self. Can you stay late today and do such and such? No, I'm sorry, I cannot. Right? So knowing that self-neglect is the telltale sign, when you really want to say no, or you want to say, I can't, or you want to not be available during certain times, set your calendar to be like, I'm actually not working evenings this day. When you want to do that and you do it anyway, because you're in that codependent pattern, that's that self-neglect. So in the healing season, we start doing self-care. Boundaries is a way of doing self-care. That's actually something, when I decided as a therapist, I just had too many clients and there were too many people coming to try and get on my calendar. I was like, I'm working too many hours. I'm not really seeing the benefits financially that I really feel like I should, given my experience and knowledge and expertise. I'm gonna raise my prices a little bit, right? That's a boundary that I need to hold. And it was so uncomfortable for me. Oh, it just felt like just so overwhelming. But it was a boundary of me saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't see everybody at this rate. I can see some people at this rate, but I can see everybody else at this rate, because this is what, my time is worth at this point. And that was a form of self-care, because it was a boundary to accessing me constantly and at the level that didn't feel like it was sustainable to me. So, what have you experienced in some of that? Knowing self-neglect is kind of the telltale sign of codependency. What have you done in ways to kind of self-care?
For me, one, I love that you said that about sitting in the discomfort. I'm learning how to sit in the discomfort,
right? How
to set a boundary so that I can give self-care to myself, and sitting there, because, with my early life training, which it was training, right?
Yep.
It was, okay, if I'm uncomfortable, I need to fix it. Something outside of me needs fixed, and I'm learning how to sit in it. I am learning how to really trust other people to do their own work. And, once again, we don't surround, if we're not surrounded by people that we don't like, I mean, it's
Right,
not,
right, yeah,
it's not the tendency that most people have. And so I'm trusting them that even if they don't like the boundary that I've set, that they're doing their own work on their own.
sure, yeah,
And if they come to me, I'll talk about it, but that they recognize it. But I am also learning how to communicate where that boundary is.
right, yes,
I think so many people, they set, they recognize they're being codependent, they're overgiving. They, I stop where they're at, I'm setting a boundary, and
yeah,
this is where it's at. And then they never communicate that
right,
to
right,
someone. I'm like, you have to tell the person
yes,
that
yeah,
this is where your boundary is.
right,
And because if you don't, feelings get hurt, people get
mhm,
confused.
mhm,
They, as an example, they stop inviting you places because
right,
they think that
right.
you don't like
They
them
don't
anymore.
understand where this came from, yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And which actually, if you want to continue with that relationship somewhere down the line, or even now, but just in a healthier place, you have no foundation to start from
Right,
now
yeah,
because you basically destroyed it.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so being able, like, I communicate, okay, I know I've done this. This is what I used to do. I'm no longer doing this.
right, right,
And and depending on the relationship, I'll give them a reason,
right,
because I feel like in order to build this other relationship that is my focus right now, it requires me to give my time and energy here,
exactly, yeah,
whatever it is. And then you can build from that.
yes,
Those who've benefited from the taking sometimes will go away.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I've found that there's a true connection there. There's a true respect and it's reciprocal. They'll return. And usually they return
mhm,
healed
yeah.
in some way, at least with
Yeah,
me,
yeah, yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that is, I tend to say, regardless whatever relationship it is, healthy boundaries are really a gift to the relationship, because what it's saying is, hey, something that one way that we've been navigating this relationship has stopped really feeling good to me, but I still care about the relationship and I want it to continue. So this is the boundary I'm gonna have, but I'd still like to continue moving forward in the relationship. So it's actually a very loving gift that you give the relationship. It may not always feel that way to the other person. It may not always feel that way to you in the moment of sitting in the discomfort. That discomfort will come and it will go, right? But it is a gift to the relationship so that it can go from maybe a lower level to a higher level of connection and of understanding and of meeting each other's needs.
Well, and I think so many people don't know what their self-care needs are.
Mm-hmm,
And being
mm-hmm,
able, I think you first have to define what that is for you. Like,
mm-hmm.
I require a lot of alone time. I enjoy my alone time.
Right.
I am not lonely, people.
Yes.
Trust me,
Yeah.
I truly do enjoy it. Now, I also enjoy being around others, but
Mm-hmm.
there's times in my life that have required, I call it my hermiting. It
Mm-hmm.
requires that. And because I'm doing personal work, or my focus is on my writing, or it's on
Yes.
other creative endeavors. And solitude is part of that. I've had people who do not like me needing that much alone time. They really
Mm-hmm.
push back on it.
Mm-hmm.
They criticize it. They make fun of it, and it used to really bother me. It did.
Right.
I thought
Right.
there was something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finally recognized that that's a need that I have, it's not
Yes.
just a want, it's a need.
Mm-hmm.
It's how I recharge. I'm a better Lisa because
Yes.
I do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care
Yeah.
what
Well, yeah.
what
And
other
I
people
think,
think. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that actually is probably the number one thing I would suggest to people who they're like, hey, I'm listening to this, I'm raising my hand, I'm recognizing I have these codependent tendencies, or I find myself in codependent relationships over and over and over again, regardless of whether it's intimate friendships, work relationships, whatever. How can I start healing from this? And that would be the number one thing, is I would say, start spending some time alone, because that aloneness for somebody with codependency is so uncomfortable, because we really want somebody else to meet our needs. You know, we're conditioned to take action in getting somebody to meet our needs. You know, if I do this, if I show up like this, if I change my hair like this, you know, let me do to get somebody else to meet my needs. So spending alone time, and if you're in a relationship, you know, be like, I'm, you know, starting, you know, this next week, I'm going to make sure 8 o'clock on these days, I'm by myself, you know, that I'm going hiking or I'm doing this or whatever. But you have to have some plan of being alone with yourself, because that discomfort is typically the thing that propels you to move into those patterns. So that would be the first step I would tell somebody. If you're recognizing that you have these codependent tendencies, start finding time to be with yourself.
And one thing that I encourage people to do that come to me and they, you know, they share that they don't know what they feel or they're uncomfortable, or is to, you know, check in regularly with themselves and be able to label your emotions deeper than the shallow, I'm fine, or, you know, I'm hungry, whatever, you know, go deeper, look deeper. And, you know, I even encourage people to set their alarm on their phone 5-6 times a day. And when that alarm goes off, they stop for 5 minutes and really explore. Because like you said, we're always looking outside of ourselves. We're checking in with friends, especially if we're the giver in that codependent relationship. And we're always checking in on others, yet we don't check in on ourselves.
Yes.
And so I do encourage that as well. Do you?
Yeah, and I think that is actually something you can do, especially in that aloneness, is how am I feeling? You know, I'm feeling really lonely right now, you know, and then ask yourself, well, what can I do for myself right now? What should I do for somebody else? What should I do for other people to love me? What can I do for myself right now? Well, I can make myself a nice dinner. It would feel good to like have this or that. I love making that. I can do that for myself. Or I can, you know, go take a run. I love running. And so you're really talking and having this conversation of how can I meet my needs right now? And that is such a deafening, you know, conversation to have, because in codependent relationships, our needs are always at the forefront, but we're not trying to meet them. We're trying to get somebody else to meet them. So in those alone moments, really having conversations of how can I show up for myself right now? How can I use my energy to meet my own needs right now?
So when you get a couple that comes in, and let's say that they're, you know, years down the road, and, you know, codependency is, you know, definitely, you know, the zipper of that relationship, right? It's what's holding it together is the codependency. What is the first thing that you will tell them or guide them to do? Like, what is the very first thing as a codependent couple that you would say, here's the first step?
Actually, that's the very first thing, is in the relation, have defined alone time, separate from being in this relationship and having all of the conversations here about the issues. Separate and go have some alone time, whether it's, you know, like Thursdays, you know, this partner goes and, you know, goes to the gym by themselves, and then this person goes and does this by themselves, but go have alone time separately to really check in with themselves. And real, you know, because they'll come to therapy and be like, well, you know, he's doing this and she's doing this and they're doing that, you know, and it's just the symptoms of it, because they haven't really separated enough to check in with themselves and be like, what doesn't feel good? You know, it doesn't feel good when I feel like I'm the one that constantly has to change this or do this, right? And the other one will be like, well, I just want them to do more. Like, why can't they do X, Y, and Z? And that's where they're in this dance of not really separating to have their own needs met separately, and then coming together into the relationship and sharing those pieces. And in that sharing and showing up, they actually start meeting that connection and belonging needs that they're really trying to look for. We don't really need other people to give us the needs of validating us and affirming us and all of those things. That's the piece we should get internally, is I'm good and valuable and worthy because I am. The connection and the belonging is really what we're looking for in, let's say, intimate partnerships, right? Even in workplace, I have a connection with this mission. I belong on this project, right? So in couples, they're trying to show up to be validated and affirmed by each other, right? When really that needs to be done separately. And then the connection and belonging is what occurs in the relationship.
And do you encourage them both also to be able to really have a sense of self, a sense of identity? I see couples who they start changing everything about themselves to fit, to belong. And so is that also, you know, checking in with yourself, but also really get clear about who you are and what you value, and then start moving forward that way?
Yeah.
Is that where it starts to break down?
Yes, because
Relationship?
oftentimes people in a relationship and they're like, I love dancing. I want my partner to go dancing with me. Right. And it's like, well, your partner may only be going dancing because they want you to be to be happy with them. Like if your partner doesn't really want to go dancing and they're not good at dancing, and you get frustrated when they start dancing with you because you're like, what? You're not making me feel like the star or whatever. Like, go dance with your own people, right? Like if dancing is something that fills you up and lights you up, let it be your thing as an individual. Let your partner come watch you, you know, and your partner can be like, oh, I love seeing you like doing your thing. Or let your partner come back to the relationship after dancing, be lit up and want to share it with you, because in that energy, they want to connect. You know, I've had clients who have had farms, right? And one partner like, I love farms, I want farm animals. And the other partner is like, I hate this life, right? And they're trying to do it together. Well, no, have the farm, but have a farm hand that's going to help the partner. And then, you know, they can come together in the relationship, and this partner can tell you all about the goats and all those things. And the other partner is like, oh, I love seeing you lit up about the goats, right? It's okay to live and have these independent, fulfilling lives, and then come back to the relationship to share that excitement, and the other partner gets to join you in that lighting up, you know? Yeah, some of those things you're going to do together. You have to have hobbies as a couple, but you also get to go and have these independent, fulfilling lives and bring that to the relationship too.
So if you have a partner who is not supportive of the person going and doing their thing, would you say that that is a tell of this is unhealthy and may not be salvageable? Is there at any point where you're like, okay, here is something is so out of balance that we may not be able to salvage this?
Yeah, I mean, if you as a partner know that your partner loves dancing, but you're like, I don't want you going dancing because I think that's inappropriate for you to dance with other partners, you know, and kind of puts this shame and stuff around it, then yes, that's a telltale sign that partner is not letting you have an independent, fulfilling life. Now, this has to be appropriate for a relationship, right? Like, you can't be like, listen, I am my best self when I club every single weekend and you stay home with the kids, right? Like, I'm my best self there, right? No, because that can be really damaging to the relationship. And that can actually move into this codependent, anxious, avoidant attachment, right? So it has to be appropriate in that the partner recognizes that that's something that the other partner really needs to be independently happy and healthy, and then can come to the relationship and be happy and healthy. But if if one of the partners is like, no, I want to deny that for you because I feel like it all should come here, then that's a telltale sign that this relationship really does have some significant issues.
So with being, someone, who is on a healing path with codependency, if you're working with them, so when would you recognize, like, oh, you're healing this, you're working within it? Like, what would you encourage people to look for signs that you are healing this?
I think one of the best things I really look for, one of the most important things I look for, is a term called detachment, right? And detachment is really, removing yourself from the reactions or responses of the other person, right? So what that means is that I can say what I think, feel, or what I need to do, and I can detach from how that other person reacts or responds, right? And I can sit in that discomfort of, I can say, so if I'm in a therapy session, one of the partners can say, hey, I'm not comfortable, with, doing X, Y, and Z, and then is able to just sit and in the discomfort of the other partner having a reaction or a response, and not coming back and be like, I mean, it's okay, I feel like maybe I can, like, change this or change that, or, it's really not that important to me. Or also not coming back and being like, that's ridiculous. Why are you always saying that? I should be able to do whatever. Because even an aggressive response is trying to get them to change, So I look for detachment in that, hey, I understand you might be frustrated with that. I understand that this is something new, but it is still something that I feel like I need to do and honor for myself.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah.
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 Good.
I think detachment for me has been probably one of the most healing behaviors that I've implemented. And one of the ways that I've been able to detach is through a spiritual lens, where the recognition that we are all on our own individual journeys.
Right.
And if I am trying to convince someone that the choice that they have made is the wrong choice, well, that's not detachment. Like you said, there's manipulation in there, trying to get my needs met, even my ego needs, my wounded ego needs.
Yep. That's really, that's where it comes down, right?
I'm right. That it's an ego base. And so when I recognize that, they're going to have lessons that they need to have, good and bad, that are going to help form them. You recognize you can detach from anything.
You can. Yep. You
don't have to be attached to any outcomes, because you are not in control of those things.
Right.
And you shouldn't be, because they are on their own journeys.
Yep.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, that's what a codependent partner is really trying to do, is trying to control the other person, to do what they want them to do. And detachment is really a beautiful place to be, especially, on your own journey, because again, if we don't keep up our self-care, if we don't keep our perspective taking, we do tend to slip and ebb and flow on it. But the more we can detach from needing to control other people, especially with what we think, feel, and do, the healthier we are showing up in that relationship or in any other future relationships that we may have.
I so love this conversation, Cristine, and I look forward to even delving into it deeper with you. We've touched upon a lot of different aspects of it, but there's so much more.
So much. Yeah, because you can even break down codependency and the relationship patterns that they tend to have with the other personality type, right? And that is something I think people are very hungry for, is, remember we talked about the ego doesn't necessarily know what's good or bad, it knows what's familiar. And so if we don't heal our codependency, we tend to attract the same familiar partners, workplaces, friendships. And so, we could even delve even deeper into some of those very specific patterns. And I know people are hungry. People are hungry to heal for themselves.
Oh yeah, I mean, it just opens up your life.
Mhm.
And, even though at first there's so much discomfort, and sometimes the discomfort ebbs and flows,
Right.
and, but it just means you're going deeper.
It does. Yeah.
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 Yeah. All right. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think I think this is a great conversation. I feel like what we just kind of reiterated is there's so much more we could talk about. I'd love to hear from listeners as to how they've recognized codependency in their own lives. Maybe they don't specifically, have those tendencies, but maybe they've seen loved ones or friends or whatever. And so I would love to hear, kind of their experiences or what other questions they may have about codependency.
Oh, I would too. And, I mean, once again, I don't know anyone that hasn't experienced codependency
Exactly.
or working through codependency. I mean, it truly, I really wish we could get the shame removed from
Right.
it, because it really is. I mean, it's part of the journey of life, and
It is.
we
Yeah.
learn, and, we do better.
Mhm,
That's really,
absolutely. We
yeah.
really do. Yeah.
Mhm. So good. Now, once again, if you'd like the video and it resonated, go ahead and please subscribe and like it. And also go ahead, let us know your journey with codependency. And we are going to be having guests coming up in August, which we're very excited about.
Very
We'll be
excited, yeah.
sharing more about that as it gets closer. And we hope that you continue to tune in with us and enjoy the podcast, and we will see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank
All
you,
right,
guys.
thanks, Christine. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.